So did you hear the story of the minister who visited a very elderly parishioner at the nursing home? And he went up to her in the lounge and he said, "Good morning. Do you know who I am?" And the lady smiled back very sweetly and said, "No, honey, I'm afraid I don't. But if you'll ask that nice woman over at the desk, she can tell you who you are." Do we know who we are as a church? Or is there any danger of us losing our Wesleyan identity? That leads me to another story. This one's a longer one. This is our story. This is our heritage. This is our legacy as Wesleyans. Think of it as the prequel to the modern ministry of the church. Here's a quote for you. "Who we are is who we were." Well, this is who we were. In Jamestown, North Carolina, near High Point, there's a fascinating relic of a bygone era. The broad-porched house and the Pennsylvania-style bank barn of Mendenhall Plantation. Mendenhall Plantation seems oddly out of step with a modern world that hurries by on the highway just outside its doors. But then Mendenhall Plantation has always seemed out of step, even when it was built in 1811. Because Mendenhall Plantation was a plantation without slaves. The Mendenhalls were Quakers and abolitionists. They were committed to the abolition of slavery. It's not surprising, then, that an abolitionist from Ohio would spend his first night in North Carolina at that house. His name was Adam Crooks. The year was 1847. Adam Crooks was saved at age 4, sanctified at age 16, in the Methodist Church in his hometown in Leesville, Ohio. As a young Christian, he was troubled by the silence of his denomination on the pressing issue of the day, which was slavery. Slavery was the issue of the day in America. Congress was juggling the admission of slave states and free states to the Union, hoping to compromise its way to peace. America was literally and precisely half slave and half free, and it had been ever since the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It was law. That precarious balancing act meant that slavery dominated the agenda of Congress. But then slavery dominated the conversation of most Americans, too. It's the churches that were strangely silent on the issue of slavery. Not just the Methodist Church, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, almost everyone else. But then a new denomination came to Adam Crooks' hometown, a denomination whose outspoken opposition to slavery echoed loudly in the silence around them. They were the Wesleyan Methodists. And with them, Adam Crooks found a home. The Wesleyan Methodists were being faithful not only to their hearts, but also to their heritage when they took a stand against slavery. John Wesley himself had been one of the first in England to oppose the slave trade. He wrote a book in 1774 called Thoughts on Slavery, an early call for church and society to rid itself of this evil. The last letter he ever wrote was written to William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament and an evangelical Christian, encouraging him in his legislative efforts to abolish slavery in the British Empire. So Methodism, the church that John Wesley founded, had an anti-slavery legacy. Opposition to slavery among the Methodists should have been a given, but it wasn't. Methodism had become America's largest denomination, and it didn't want to rock the boat on a divisive issue like slavery. In fact, one Methodist bishop even owned slaves himself. It's ironic, but the church which saluted John Wesley as its founder had turned its back on his principles. One Methodist who hadn't was a young presiding elder, we would say district superintendent in New England, by the name of Orange Scott. He rallied his fellow ministers and laity in the anti-slavery cause. But as he opposed slavery, he found that many Methodist leaders opposed him. At the Methodist General Conference of 1836, one speaker said on the conference floor, in debate, that he wished Scott were in heaven. That's a very polite way of saying drop dead. In the annual conferences which followed, Methodist bishops would refuse to give abolitionists like Scott the floor, the right to speak. They would recognize others who wanted to criticize abolitionists. They wouldn't recognize abolitionists' right to speak. One Methodist historian put it this way: the bishops decided that they would be soft on slavery but hard on abolitionists. So on November 8th, 1842, 5 ministers announced that they were withdrawing from the Methodist church that they loved. Orange Scott, Jotham Horton, Leroy Sunderland, Luther Lee, and L.C. Matlack. The music you hear is from Ken Burns' great documentary on the Civil War. It evokes that era for us. And it also conveys to us the sadness that these men felt as they left the church which had been their home. It was a painful decision. In his book explaining why they were leaving, Orange Scott gave 2 main reasons: the evil of slavery and the oppressive hand of the bishops. They would begin a new denomination, he said, and in this new denomination there would be no slaveholders. And by the way, there would be no bishops either. Lest anyone fail to understand where they were coming from, they named their denominational periodical the True Wesleyan. Emphasis on true. The new church grew rapidly. Other Christians were drawn by their passion for social justice in the name of Christ. Scott said on one occasion, "We are anti-slavery. We are anti-intemperance," by which he meant alcohol. In fact, he said, "We are anti-everything wrong." Now there's a mission statement for you. They also boldly announced their intention to disobey a federal law. It was the Fugitive Slave Law, which required anyone who encountered an escaped slave, even in the North, to return them to their owners. This, the Wesleyans publicly said, "We will not do." This is an early act in American history of civil disobedience. And those who took that stand were following in the footsteps of Peter and the apostles, who said to the Sanhedrin in the book of Acts, "We must obey God rather than men." In a wonderful montage done for a history celebration years ago, Wesleyan minister and artist Edwin Wallace captured the spirit of today's Wesleyan Church by reminding us of the spirit of its heroes of the past. Look in the upper left-hand corner of this poster. Appropriately enough, he pictured Orange Scott alongside the slaves whose freedom he had given his life to gain. Orange Scott died of tuberculosis and overwork in 1847 at the age of 47. Just 4 years into the life of the new denomination he helped to establish. Not only the church, but also the nation lost one of its strongest anti-slavery voices. Historian Donald Matthews of Princeton and the University of North Carolina gave Orange Scott that tribute. At Scott's funeral, his friend Luther Lee said, "He lived in advance of his age." We would say he was ahead of his time. The situation continued to deteriorate. Clouds of war loomed on America's horizon. In a famous speech some years later, Abraham Lincoln would say, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." By the way, he was quoting Jesus out of Mark chapter 3. Lincoln continued, "I believe this nation cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. He meant North versus South, of course. But not everyone in the South was pro-slavery. In North Carolina, 40 anti-slavery Methodists withdrew from their church as a witness that they believed slavery was morally wrong. They had heard of the Wesleyan Methodists. They asked them for a pastor. This was not a request easily granted. To be an abolitionist above the Mason-Dixon line was one thing. To cross it in the turbulent days before the Civil War was entirely another. The risks were great. And the Wesleyans didn't feel free to appoint someone to go. It had to be a volunteer. We have an eyewitness account of what happened next on the floor of the annual conference in Ohio. After a season of prayer, the quote goes, Brother Crooks arose. His cheeks were as pale as marble. I will go, he said. Sustained by your prayers and in the name of my Savior, I will go to North Carolina. Adam Crooks was now 23, newly ordained and single. He knew it would be hard. He had no idea how hard it would be. In his journal, the first day of his journey south, he wrote, "The road is rough." Dr. Roy Nicholson, the early historian of Southern Wesleyan history, added a comment. Nicholson said his road would be rough for the next 4 years. In North Carolina, Crooks was labeled an outside agitator, a dangerous radical, a traitor to the white race. He was also labeled a disturber, and that charge was certainly true. He was tarred and feathered in effigy. Walking down the streets of Jamestown, he saw a dummy dressed like him, tarred and feathered on the street. He was prohibited from speaking on the courthouse grounds in Forsyth and Guilford counties in North Carolina, the counties where Greensboro, High Point, and Winston-Salem are today. Despite the First Amendment right of free speech, North Carolina judges ruled that that constitutional guarantee did not apply to one group, and those were Wesleyans. A book just recently published on the violations of the rights of free speech in the South before the Civil War uses as a primary example the Wesleyans. Crooks was dragged from his pulpit and beaten. Twice he was poisoned, once by a false friend who said, "Your life is in danger, come stay with me." He survived an assassination attempt when armed men lying in ambush one day saw that he was not alone and decided against an attack. Through all of this, the question that challenged him is the one you see on the screen. This is his question, and he asked it of himself. Can you give your life for the cause? Look at that list of persecutions again. If it looks familiar, it may be because it resembles St. Paul's resume in 2 Corinthians. Adam Crooks came to North Carolina to build the kingdom, and he began by building a meeting house near the town of Snow Camp in Alamance County, North Carolina. It was named Freedom's Hill because it stood for freedom for slave and sinner alike. The congregation started on it soon after he arrived, late in October of 1847, rather than waiting for warmer months in the spring. And they finished it and dedicated it in March of the next year, 1848. Freedom's Hill was then the first Wesleyan church built in the South. It was a simple building, 27 feet by 36, erected on a foundation of fieldstones. The hand-hewn pews were connected with pegs, not nails. And the church had no heat source at first. The windows were just shutters, no glass. Simple as it was, it must have seemed like a cathedral to those Wesleyans who had waited and prayed for that day. Almost immediately, the Freedom's Hill congregation began to participate in the Underground Railroad. That railroad, of course, had no train or tracks. It was a network of safe houses, all the way from captivity to freedom for escaping slaves. Routes to Ohio, Indiana, and New York were well established, with a major southern terminus of that historic Underground Railway being the Piedmont area of North Carolina, where Snow Camp and Freedom's Hill were located. Slaves were instructed to follow the Big Dipper.
Follow the drinking gourd.
Follow the drinking gourd.
Follow the drinking gourd.
And it will lead you north to freedom. Frederick Douglass's newspaper for African Americans in the 19th century was called the North Star. Imagine yourself on a life and death journey, a run to freedom, tracking one of those paths, following the drinking gourd. Imagine yourself hidden under hay in a friendly barn, waiting anxiously for nightfall and the next leg of your journey. Imagine yourself in a false bottom wagon like this one from Mendenhall, Plantation, praying that you aren't discovered.
And the first quail calls, follow the drinking.
Imagine yourself in a hollow tree. There was a hollow tree less than a mile from Freedom's Hill. It was between two congregations, the Wesleyans and the Quakers, at Cane Creek Friends Meeting. Each congregation would hide slaves there during the daylight hours, take them out at night to freedom. And as you imagine how it would feel for you to be in that tree, think how grateful you would be to God for people like the Wesleyans, who would be His hands and His feet and His voice against slavery, winning you freedom. Today at Snow Camp, there is a popular outdoor drama that depicts the origins of the Underground Railroad in that region. Adam Crooks is a prominent character in that play. Other Wesleyans were active in the Underground Railroad too. For example, Laura Smith Haviland was a Wesleyan Methodist from Michigan who worked closely with Levi Coffin, who was called the father of the Underground Railroad. Her home was the first station of the Underground Railroad in the state of Michigan, and she's been honored with a statue in her hometown of Adrian, Michigan. She worked among African American refugees in Kansas, and the town of Haviland, Kansas is named in her honor. To us, she's a hero. But in the title of her autobiography, she saw it simply as a woman's life work. How about this? The February 1996 issue of National Geographic magazine ran a fascinating photo of a face carved into the soft clay of a tunnel just newly discovered under a house in New York State. Experts quickly determined that that house was a station on the Underground Railroad. This tunnel hid slaves during the day and led them to safety after nightfall. Hidden so well, it escaped detection for over a century. The slaves who were hiding there left behind mementos of their presence carved into the soft clay of the tunnel during the daylight hours while they were waiting. That tunnel was under the Wesleyan Methodist parsonage in Syracuse, New York, and the pastor was Luther Lee. One aspect of the Underground Railroad only recently being explored has to do with quilts, of all things. Plantation slaves communicated in a number of different ways. One of their codes involved quilt designs. Scholars call these quilts fabric griots, a griot being an African community storyteller, a keeper of the cultural values, the historical heritage. Hanging out a quilt in the slave quarters must have seemed innocent enough to the unknowing slave master or the plantation owner, but to the slave population, it could send a message. The title of a recent book about this tells it all. They were hidden in plain view. Often these messages related to escape plans. One design was called Flying Geese, was one of the most popular. The direction of the triangle gives the direction of escape. I'd better give you one more clue. It's the darkest triangle that gives you the direction of escape. Another popular design was called the drunkard's path. This design was not directional, it was instructional. It didn't tell them where to run, it told them how to run. The message of this erratic design is don't head north in a straight line. You're too easy to track. Don't forget to zig. Don't forget to zag. In keeping with this principle, the stations of the Underground Railroad were not laid out in a straight line due north either. Still another design was the wagon wheel. For one thing, it symbolized movement and motion, and the message seemed to be, it's time to travel, or we might say, let's roll. Also, a false bottom wagon was often the vehicle of escape from the slave quarters. And so there may be some connection between this wagon as escape vehicle, this rolling wheel idea, and the notable emphasis in African American spirituals on the chariot. Swing low, sweet chariot is just one example. Good news, chariot's coming. And maybe even Ezekiel's wheel is a part of this Underground Railroad experience. For us as Christians whose early brothers and sisters in Christ created secret symbols like the sign of the fish to communicate with each other in days of severe persecution, the significance of these markers should be easy to appreciate. Adam Crooks was forced from North Carolina in 1851. He had been arrested and convicted on the charge of distributing a tract on the Ten Commandments. Seems odd to us, but remember that one of the commandments is thou shalt not steal. And abolitionists said slavery is man stealing. Slavery is woman stealing. Even without Crooks, though, the Underground Railroad continued to run from Snow Camp, and Freedom's Hill carried on. One of its leaders was Micajah McPherson, a layman. McPherson understood what Jesus meant by the cost of discipleship. He was caught by a lynch mob. He was hanged from a dogwood tree on his own property because of his Wesleyan principles. The mob returned later to cut him down because they said they needed the rope to hang another Wesleyan. Micajah was still alive. He crawled back to his house. His wife nursed him back to health, and he survived to age 85, living more than 3 decades past the end of the Civil War. This gavel was made from the wood of the dogwood tree on which Micajah McPherson was hanged. It's on display in the archives at Southern Wesleyan University. Also on display there is another piece of history through the generosity of the Williams family, whose ancestor initially gave the land for Freedom's Hill Church in 1847-48. We have this early membership roll from Freedom's Hill. The ink is faint, but on page 1 you can still clearly read the names, and one of them is Micajah McPherson. Let me illustrate the place of Wesleyans in the abolitionist movement in another way. Just 2 years ago, 2002, Oxford University Press published an important legal reference called The Oxford Companion to American Law. On the cover, superimposed over a view of the Supreme Court building, is a painting which depicts one of the most historic cases ever to come before that court. So important that it was chosen for the cover. Look more closely at the painting. It was the trial of the slaves on the Spanish ship Amistad. Slaves who successfully rebelled against their captors, but that were then recaptured in American waters and brought to trial. They were on trial for their lives, charged with murder in the death of the Spanish slavers who were killed in the uprising aboard ship when the slaves escaped. An American abolitionist, Lewis Tappan, funded their legal defense. And former President of the U.S., John Quincy Adams, was their defense attorney. He pled their case before the Supreme Court. It's an interesting story. Pardon me. Steven Spielberg made a movie about it just a few years ago. It's a gratifying story, too. The slaves were found not guilty. But why talk about it here? What's it got to do with us? 2 points of connection. First connection. Lewis Tappan shared a rather unusual honor with Leroy Sunderland, one of those first 5 Wesleyans whose names we saw earlier. Tappan and Sunderland were paired up together on a wanted poster in New Orleans in the 1840s. And the price on their heads was $10,000. $10,000 in the economy of the 1840s. Calculate that for inflation. And their crime was that they were too effective as abolitionists. Second connection. After the trial, the Amistad Defense Fund, which had been so successful, was continued, used now not for legal means, but to fund anti-slavery missions. Those missions included Adam Crooks and the Wesleyans at Freedom's Hill and the other churches that they planted in North Carolina and Virginia. That's how close Crooks and Freedom's Hill were to the very heart of America's abolitionist movement. Speaking of Adam Crooks, what happened to this courageous Christian after his Freedom's Hill experience? In the years which followed, Crooks served his church in the highest offices it had to offer. He was denominational editor. He was president of the General Conference. Perhaps his greatest contribution came in the days of the Union movement, when many Wesleyan leaders chose to return to Methodism because, after all, the battle against slavery had ended with the end of the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. They saw no reason for the continued existence of the denomination. Adam Crooks did. Adam Crooks saw it as a platform for the more effective preaching of biblical holiness. After all, Wesleyan Methodists were the first denomination to have a separate article of religion in their discipline about entire sanctification. He also saw it as an important arm of the fight for temperance, a movement which would later be called the Prohibition movement. And then there was the matter of women's rights. Recently, I had the privilege of visiting the site of the first women's rights convention in U.S. history. The date of that convention was 1848, and the place was the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. In 1848, women's rights was not the radical feminism of today. In 1848, the issues were basic human rights for women, including the right to vote, the right to hold property in their own names if they were married, even the right to sign a legal contract. It also involved the right to ministry. The first woman ordained to the Christian ministry in America was Antoinette Brown. And although she was a Congregationalist, her ordination sermon was preached by a Wesleyan, Luther Lee, because her own pastor refused to do it. Wesleyan women were ordained too, the earliest more than 140 years ago. Wesleyan Methodists were also the first denomination in America to give equal vote to the laity in church conferences. It's the consistent application of a principle: the rights of slaves, the rights of women, the rights of lay people in the church. The Wesleyan witness in the world was clear. In God's name, we intend to make a difference. And they did. The history books give them credit for that. In 1957, historian Timothy Smith, who would become the president of the American Society of Church History, wrote a groundbreaking study entitled Revivalism and Social Reform. I'll admit to some partiality about Timothy Smith. His father was once president of what is now Southern Wesleyan University. And Tim Smith was born in what was then the president's house on our campus. His prize-winning study of revivalism and social reform changed the mind of secular historians about the national impact of evangelical Christianity in the era before the Civil War. In that book, he demonstrated conclusively that warm-hearted Christians like the Wesleyans were at the forefront of America's moral crusades. By the time the Pilgrim Holiness Church was born in the Holiness Revival of the late 19th century and early 20th, a half century after the birth of the Wesleyan Methodist, some of the issues had changed. Slavery wasn't a question any longer, of course, but their answers to the new questions of their age had the same fervency. With their Wesleyan Methodist colleagues, they shared a shared theology. They had shared values. They had a shared commitment. For example, Seth C. Reese was a powerful preacher, a dynamic evangelist, but he never restricted his ministry to the sanctuary. He organized his congregation in Providence, Rhode Island, for example, into 6 different corps, C-O-R-P-S, as in Salvation Army Corps. He called them the Slum Corps, the Prison Corps, the City Mission Corps, the Sailor Corps, the Hospital Corps, the Open Air Corps. They personalized Matthew 25. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. And Pilgrim co-founder Martin Wells Knapp exhibited extraordinary energy in founding a missions agency, a magazine, a Bible college, and authoring a number of powerful books. The first of which he financed by auctioning off his household goods. By auctioning off his household goods, presumably with permission from his wife. May I give you one more good example of this spirit? John Clement began his ministry in the Pilgrim Holiness Church, continued it in the Wesleyan Methodist Church. The groundwork for a church that I pastored in western North Carolina was laid in one of his tent revivals, a revival in which a man was shot in the leg for supporting Clement. Sounds like Freedom's Hill a century later. On one occasion, the tent that he was using for his revival services was burned. Dr. Lee Haynes tells how Clement bottled up the ashes of his tent, found a new place to hold services, held up the bottle of ashes, and told his congregation that he planned to take it with him to the judgment as a witness against those who had done that deed. Before the service was over, his persecutors were at the altar, and a revival began in that city. And John Clement bought a new tent. Earlier, I referred to the film Amistad. Anthony Hopkins played John Quincy Adams in that film, and in his summation before the Supreme Court, he emphasized America's legacy of freedom. He wondered, what would America's first freedom fighters from the days of the Revolution, men like his own father, John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, what would they think about the case before the court? Glancing back can help us move ahead, he believed. Because, and here's where I got the earlier quote, who we are is who we were. The past is prologue. If we don't know where we came from, we'll have trouble figuring out where we're going. We really don't know who we are until we know who we were. Well, who are we? Who were we? We were world changers. We were people who made a difference in our society because Christ had made a difference in us. We were, in the name of Christ, the enemies of slavery, and everybody knew it. Some liked it, some didn't, but everybody knew it. We were, in the name of Christ, defenders of the basic rights of women, and everybody knew it. We were, in the name of Christ, the conscience of a nation. We were, in the name of Christ, bold witnesses for the gospel who weren't deterred by threats or harassment. We were the slum corps. We were the prison corps. We were the city mission corps. We were the evangelists who had tents burned down around us and then used the ashes as an object lesson in our next sermon. Talk about purpose-driven. Rick Warren could take lessons. A common thread through all of these stories is the cost of discipleship. We paid a high price. But like Paul, we wanted to know Christ not only in the power of his resurrection, but in the fellowship of his sufferings. And beside, whatever the cost of discipleship might be, our forefathers in the faith figured that the cost to the enemy's side was infinitely greater. In 1951, Richard Niebuhr wrote a book, Christ and Culture, in which he profiled the responses the church has made throughout history to the world around it. Some have preached, he said, a Christ of culture. They look to see what the world is doing and they pronounce Christ's blessing upon it, whatever it is. In reaction to that, some preached Christ against culture, in which the church is supposed to close its doors against the world, to live safe inside a fortress mentality. Niebuhr said neither is the biblical model, but our best hope is in the Christ who engages culture and transforms it. Have you heard that this week? He said a primary model for this, and Niebuhr was no Wesleyan. Niebuhr was not Arminian. Niebuhr said a primary model for this is John Wesley. That's our legacy. We're spiritual descendants of people who engaged the world to transform it in Jesus' name. That's our spiritual DNA. That's who we are because that's who we were. Compassionate ministries can transform this world in the name of Christ. Standing up for the powerless in the power of the Holy Spirit can transform this world in the name of Christ. The bold witness of a post-Pentecost church can transform this world in the name of Christ. During World War II, one unit compiled such an impressive record that divisional headquarters sent out an officer to find out why. If he could discover their secret, he hoped to pass it on to other units so that they could model that same success. When he arrived, the officer from HQ noticed an odd abbreviation on everything in the camp. It was stenciled on the tent flaps, it was painted on the doors of the jeeps and the trucks, it was even on the pots and pans in the mess hall. Now, he prided himself in knowing every military abbreviation there was, and there were a lot of them. But this one he didn't know. AAA-O. He asked the ranking officer of that outfit, "What does that mean?" And the officer smiled and said, "I'm not surprised you don't know that one. That one's ours. We created that one. That's our motto, and it stands for anything, anywhere, anytime, bar nothing. Because that's what we're willing to do." There was no need for further investigation. The visiting brass went back to HQ. He had found his answer. When someone is prepared to do whatever it takes, at any time and in any place, without exception, without hesitation, without reservation, the secret of their success is not really a secret. AAA-O. Orange Scott, turning his back on the office of bishop, which many told him would be his if he didn't rock the boat on abolition. Adam Crooks, braving the bullets of the night riders. Micajah McPherson, witnessing to a member of his lynch mob years after the attempt on his life. Seth Reese's slum corps. Martin Wells Knapp's furniture on the auction block. Betty Tyler's orphanage in Macon, Georgia, operated on faith. the earliest Wesleyan missionaries to Sierra Leone, who packed for their voyage not in barrels, but in their own coffins. The Reformed Baptists in Canada, who were so obedient to the truth of holiness when they heard it preached that it transformed their movement and led them one day to seek out a new spiritual family and find it in the Wesleyans. A-O. Anything, anywhere, anytime, bar nothing. It's almost like our own version of Hebrews 11. And the point is the same. As those before us in our tradition were faithful in their day, so may we, so must we be faithful in our day. In 1 Timothy, Paul wrote, "Although I hope to come to you soon, I'm writing these instructions so that if I'm delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth." That's the text that Adam Crooks chose at the dedication of Freedom's Hill in March 1848. And I think I know why. How people ought to conduct themselves in the church isn't really about how to act in the sanctuary. There were no sanctuaries when Paul wrote Timothy. The Christian church was under persecution. It wouldn't build its first building for almost 2.5 centuries. Early Christians met in house churches and in other less public places. How people ought to conduct themselves in church is not about how to act in the sanctuary. It's about how to be the church. The way to be the church is to engage the unbelieving world around us in the love of God and the power of the gospel and see it transformed by the Lord. We stand, folks, on tall shoulders. Those who have gone before us have given us an amazing heritage. They've given us a legacy larger than life. Glancing back can help us move ahead. In the case of Freedom's Hill, we really don't have to glance back too much. Freedom's Hill is still with us. Over the years, the congregation of that historic old church dwindled in size, and eventually the building fell into disuse and into decay. The building, which had weathered the attacks of its enemies, now had to withstand for a while the neglect of its friends. But in 1973, the pastor and people of Neighbors Grove Wesleyan Church in Asheboro, North Carolina, stepped in to rescue and reclaim this part of their Wesleyan heritage. Led by Pastor Richard Kinchy and youth pastor Mike Engel, they went to work. And there was plenty of work to do, but it was a labor of love. The repaired church was moved to the conference grounds of the North Carolina district of the Wesleyan Church in Colfax, where it remained in a place of honor for more than 20 years. The district superintendent then was my father. And I remember that he and the other leaders of the district believed that Freedom's Hill could inspire a whole new generation of Wesleyans. They were right. But when the conference grounds were sold, the future of the church was again very much in doubt. Reverend Wes Brown, who at that time was the pastor at Shady Grove, sought to preserve the old church. And Dr. David Spittle found a way to make that happen. Southern Wesleyan University, he said, will be the curator of this historical treasure. And so every board in that building was carefully marked, outside and inside. And the church was disassembled, all the way down to the sleepers underneath. Ground was broken for its restoration on the campus of Southern Wesleyan in October of 2000. And the old church was painstakingly reconstructed by the Southern Wesleyan crew which had disassembled it. They told me it became a labor of love for them too. Now, on the campus of Southern Wesleyan, Freedom's Hill is reborn. The building is both a restoration and a replication. Almost all the interior of the building is original. Almost all the walls and ceiling, all of the flooring, the pulpit, the pews, The lampstands, the window sashes, the mourner's bench in front of the pulpit are all original. The exterior, though, was more badly damaged than anyone realized from termites, carpenter ants, and it proved impossible to preserve most of it. So the restoration crew created a faithful replica of its original appearance on the outside. One exterior feature, though, was carefully preserved: the door with its bullet holes. And on the landscape grounds, the main feature there is a prayer walk in the shape of a wagon wheel. So now, if you come to Southern Wesleyan, you can stand in Adam Crook's pulpit. But what if he stood in yours? What would he say to your congregation? What would he say to mine? My guess is that he would say what he said to the Wesleyans, the courageous Wesleyans, who sat on those very pews 156 years ago. He would say, "Be the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth. Be the church Christ loved and gave himself for. Be the church that turned the world upside down in the book of Acts. Be the church of Wesley and see nations transformed. Be the church of Adam Crooks and Seth Reese, a church that made a difference." Maybe he would say, "Be true Wesleyans." Paul said, "Follow me as I follow Christ." It's in that spirit that we can look to Orange Scott and Seth Reese and Martin Knapp and all the others who blazed a trail for us. Who would have thought in 1848, given the enemies that church had, that it would survive the decade, much less open its doors on the 21st century? Freedom's Hill still stands, and that's amazing. But more important is what it stands for. If we who are its guardians are true to our heritage, if we live up to our legacy, then it still stands for what it always stood for the salvation of souls, for the transformation of society in Jesus' name. It stands as a symbol of the legacy that we have to live up to, a symbol for the challenges facing each one of us in our own fields of ministry. Freedom's Hill still stands, and it still asks Adam Crook's old question: can you give your life for the cause? If you can, if we can, we will be the church in our era that they were in theirs.